G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.7, After the Temple Part 1, The Judeans. In the last episode, I concluded my account of the Great Revolt, that civil war within a rebellion. For the Jews living in Judea, the destruction of the capital and of the temple was devastating. The rituals of the year, with their festivals and temple sacrifices, were shattered. The power of the temple political hierarchy was broken forever. The Levites were lost to history. The Pharisees and Sadducees disappeared as organised factions. The Essenes vanished. The later rabbis depicted the Judean revolutionaries as either misguided fools or sinners. How could they be otherwise? Eleazar and Simon and John were deluded into thinking they could triumph against an overwhelming power. That they spent most of the war slaughtering each other's forces rather than the Roman army only damned them more. The terrible irony is that the war began as a quarrel between the Judeans and their neighbours because the imperial power had reneged on its century-old compact to protect Judean interests. The rebel leaders transformed that into an unwinnable war against their former guardians. By the mid-20th century, Jews understood the revolt as a symbol of Jewish heroism and the exemplar of the many bitter struggles that the Jewish people would later face in a hostile world. Israeli archaeologists in the 1960s excavated the fortress of Masada. They unearthed bones and potsherds and scrolls and weapons. The public was excited. Tourists flocked to Masada. The citadel became a popular venue for bar and bat mitzvahs. The last stand and mass suicide of the bold freedom fighters at this final holdout was glorified as the very embodiment of Jewish resilience, the Zionist enterprise, and the young state of Israel. Masada shall not fall again. In the 21st century, both scholarly and public enthusiasm waned. Although the archaeologists had pumped their findings, they really found very little to support their conclusions. The bones once regarded as the last remains of the Judean fighters are now believed as more likely those of later Roman occupiers. The arrowheads found were simply not up to Roman military standard. They were reinterpreted not as the evidence of Roman assaults, but discarded Judean weapons never fired in anger. The emerging scholarly consensus still relies on Josephus, but emphasises his accounts that the defenders of Masada took no part in the war. Rather, they operated a bandit economy, plundering the Judean and Idumean locals for sustenance. Masada was not the last stand of heroes, but a refugee camp for families fleeing violence. The Judeans viewed the Great Revolt as a justified response to the imperial power's failure to guarantee their safety against their many ethnic rivals in the region. The Romans, of course, always thought of it as a law and order problem. The Judeans had been faithful allies for a century, since the earliest days of Herod the Great. Now they had inexplicably turned against their patrons. The Romans had to establish security, had to protect the trade routes between Egypt and Syria. The whole tragedy could have been avoided if only the Romans had picked better procurators and prefects, and listened to Judean grievances against those bureaucrats. Rome never trusted the friendship of the Judeans again. Vespasian quartered a legion in the area. Although the Roman ally Herod Agrippa II was allowed to keep his territories, when he finally died after a long and melancholy reign, the Romans brought his lands under direct rule. I now have to present a mild disagreement within the academic community. As a humble buff, I am in no position to adjudicate. Most professors emphasise Roman moderation after the revolt. Yes, Rome showed as much mercy to the Judean rebels as it did to any other rebels. None. Still, the Emperor Vespasian had no intention of punishing the Jews of the diaspora. He conducted no pogroms. Jews everywhere were free to worship their God as they always had. They were allowed to live and work in Palestine and the wreck that was Jerusalem. The Judean inhabitants of Roman cities retained all the privileges that Rome had granted them over the past century. They were still exempt from performing the patriotic pagan state rituals they found so offensive. Some modern scholars adopt a less sanguine view. They argue that local Greek communities took advantage of imperial displeasure, a disapproval that encouraged hostility to those in the diaspora. Provincial governors began to favour Greeks in court cases against Judean opponents. Where before the Great Revolt, courts had punished rioters of any stripe, now they excused Greek attacks on Judeans. Whatever the case, many diaspora Jews must have been aghast at the devastation wreaked on their homeland. That resentment would explode a generation later in the Kittos War. I'll cover that horrendous conflict in a later episode. If Vespasian had no intention of punishing the diaspora, he did find a way to increase its contributions to the imperial coffers. Vespasian, that most practical and pragmatic of emperors, was ever keen to fairly but firmly ensure that all paid their taxes. For many years, the temple had tithed the million or so Judean adult men throughout the empire 2 drachma each year. With the temple gone, what was to be done with this stream of silver? With a nudge here and a tweak there, Vespasian simply diverted the river of readies from one temple to another. The temple of Jupiter in Rome, badly damaged by fire. So easy. Though they must have deeply resented the diversion, at least the diaspora Judeans were already accustomed to attacks. This tax became known as the Fiscus Judaicus. Vespasian's son and successor Domitian wrung every drachma he could out of the Judeans. We have receipts from Egypt that show he extended the tax from adult men to women and to children. The Fiscus Judaicus could now pay for the maintenance of 1 or 2 legions out of the 30 in the army. A tidy sum indeed. Domitian was also aware that some Jews avoided the tax. Some were ethnically Jewish, but concealed their origins. Others were Gentile, but lived what seemed to the Romans to be a Jewish life, without admitting the fact. We would call both of these groups Christians of some sort or another. Domitian never worked out what was going on. Around the year 98, his successor Nerva decided that there was something off about all these people. They were not really Jews at all. The Fiscus Judaicus was restricted to Judeans who continued to observe their ancestral customs. One of those customs was certainly not worshipping Christ as the Son of God. An important side effect of Nerva's changes was the definition of Jewishness as the permitted form of monotheism in the empire. Those paying the fiscus Judaicus were entitled to their ancient privileges, especially the exemption from worshipping the state gods. Jews who failed to pay were fined. So far, so simple. But Nerva's government was also aware of people who pretended to be Jewish. These impostors paid the fiscus and disdained the pagan rituals that sustained imperial rule. But they were not really Jews. They exploited a legal loophole to disrespect the emperor and the state. They were the Christians. These other monotheists, the members of the Jesus clubs, were granted no rights. The fiscus Judaicus ultimately contributed to a change in how Jews saw themselves and were seen by others. The Roman state accidentally created the first formal distinction between the Jewish religion and the Christian. Enter now the rabbis. Oddly, the term first appears in Christian literature. John the Baptist and Jesus are called rabbis. There are also scattered references in the New Testament to rabbis as a collection of learned individuals. In the 1st century, the term simply meant teacher or master. Sometime from around the year 150 on, it came to mean a religious functionary, learned in the scriptures and the law. And so it has remained. The rabbis would go on to produce a vast amount of literature to create modern Judaism. In popular Jewish belief, it is a commonplace that rabbis have existed since the time of Moses. These ancient rabbis, it was said, passed down an oral law, independent of the scriptures, until the law was compiled into written form with the Mishnah, around the year 200. Mishnah means teaching or repetition. You could call the Mishnah the fine print in God's contract. If the rabbis really could trace their lineage back 1,000 years to the time of Moses, they made no attempt to record that lengthy genealogy in the Mishnah. Nor did the rabbis rest their authority on a Mosaic pedigree. Moses' authority carries no weight in their arguments. The farthest the Mishnah lets us trace back a pedigree is to the time of the Maccabean kings. For the sordid history of that monarchy, rewind to episode 2.15, The Rise and Ruin of the Maccabeans. Scholars have always hoped to find the origins of the rabbis among one of the factions found in the books of Maccabees and Josephus, the Essenes, Sadducees, Pharisees, the Boethusians, and the mysterious fourth philosophy. The Sadducees were the party of the aristocrats and Hellenists. About the Boethusians we know nothing, save that both groups denied the immortality of the soul and the world to come. The Mishnah identifies the Sadducees and Boethusians as opponents of the rabbis. Our evidence is that the Essenes operated on the fringes of Judean society. That leaves the Pharisees, those so lambasted in the New Testament. This has been the scholarly position for decades. The foundation of this thesis rests on the house of Gamaliel. Hillel the elder, his grandson Gamaliel I, Gamaliel's son Simon ben Gamaliel, and Simon's son Gamaliel II are prominent sages in the Mishnah. We know from the New Testament and Josephus that Gamaliel I was a Pharisee. The case, it would seem, is closed. The rabbis are rebranded Pharisees. Yet doubts niggle. Rabbinic literature never identifies any person as a Pharisee or a Sadducee. Only two people in all our literature call themselves Pharisees: the historian Josephus and Paul the Apostle. The rabbis name their opposing factions, but never claim the party of the Pharisees as their ancestors. In the very few times that the faction is mentioned in the Mishnah, it is usually only to chastise its especial fussiness. Without the references to the house of Gamaliel, we would have no reason to connect the rabbis to the Pharisees. Scholars are in a bind. The rabbis had to come from somewhere. With no better an idea, the professors grudgingly hold that the rabbis were transmuted Pharisees, but happily welcome the notion that the Essenes had a part to play. Perhaps the rabbis had no interest in publicising their connection to the Pharisees. The rabbis wanted to heal the divisions between the sects, not reinforcement. Their task was eased by the elimination of the temple. Many factions had directed their anger towards what they believe was a corrupt temple establishment. With the temple gone, the sects lost their reason for existence. Modern scholars regard all the references in the Mishnah to rabbis who lived before the Great Revolt as problematic. Yes, there are no doubt some historical realities behind these people, but they are impossible to disentangle from centuries of legendary accretions. Perhaps the first sage we can give real credence to is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Ben Zakkai is yet another rabbi said to have died a centenarian. He is the man celebrated as saving Judaism from the depredations of the Emperor Vespasian. Ben Zakkai opposed the rebellion against Rome. He thought it was a fool's war. During the siege of Jerusalem, 2 of his students smuggled him past the zealot guards and out of the city, disguised as a corpse. In an unlikely turn of events, Yochanan ben Zakkai rolled out of his burial shroud in the presence of no less a personage than General Vespasian. The rabbi predicts that Vespasian will soon be emperor, and in return receives a boon. And here's a quote from the Talmud. Here's the story. When Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai reached the Roman camp, he said, "Greetings to you, the king. Greetings to you, the king." Vespasian said to him, "You are liable for 2 death penalties. One, because I am not a king, and yet you call me king. And furthermore, if I am a king, why didn't you come to me until now?" Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, "As for what you said about yourself, I am not a king. In truth, you are a king. If not now, then in the future. As if you are not a king, Jerusalem will not be handed over into your hand." In the meantime, as they were talking, a messenger arrived from Rome and said to him, "Rise, for the emperor has died, and the noblemen of Rome plan to appoint you as their leader and make you the next emperor." Vespasian then said to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, "I will be going to Rome to accept my new position. But before I leave, ask something of me that I can give you." Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, "Give me Yavna and its sages, and do not destroy it, and spare the dynasty of Rabban Gamaliel." End quote. This is all suspiciously similar to a story that Josephus tells. In the middle of the war, the hopelessly ineffective general ended up Vespasian's captive. Here Josephus speaks in the third person. Quote, "Vespasian gave strict orders that Josephus should be guarded with great caution, intending to soon send him to Nero. Hearing this, Josephus expressed a wish to speak with him alone. When all were ordered to withdraw, except his son Titus and 2 of their friends, he said, 'O Vespasian, although you suppose you have taken captive a forsaken Josephus, I have come as a messenger of great tidings. Do you send me to Nero? For what? Will any successors of Nero endure until you? You are to be Caesar O Vespasian, and Emperor, you and this your son. Bind me now still more securely, and keep me for yourself. For you, O Caesar, are not only lord over me, but over the land, and the sea, and all the human race. And certainly I deserve to be punished by closer custody than now, if I fabricate anything concerning God. When he had said this, Vespasian did not believe him. But after a little while he came to have faith in this, for God was already raising in him thoughts of obtaining the empire, and by other signs foreshadowing his advancement. End quote. Whatever the facts behind Ben Zaccai's encounter with Vespasian, the reality is that the Romans granted amnesty and haven to those Judeans it felt were no threat. They were settled in Yavna, or Jamnia, located not far from the Mediterranean coast, 50 kilometres or 31 miles northeast of Jerusalem. The Mishnah only reluctantly refers to earlier figures as a rabbi. Ben Zaccai is the first to unreservedly receive the plaudit. Possibly the Mishnah does so to create a simple foundation myth for the rabbis, one that illuminates the new age after the fog of earlier times. Tradition holds that Ben Zaccai not only founded a religious school in Yavna, but assumed the entire governmental apparatus of the old province. The two students who had smuggled him out of the city, Joshua ben Hananiah and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, joined Ben Zaccai to reconstruct their religion by assembling the traditions that were the oral law. They re-established the Sanhedrin and reconstituted the priestly courts with rabbis instead of priests. They replaced animal sacrifice with prayer. They co-opted all the powers of the state, the Levites and the priests, to their organisation. They were careful to detail the rituals of the temple, for surely it would be rebuilt soon. Ben Zaccai was succeeded by Rabban Gamaliel II. He was the son of Simon ben Gamaliel, one of the establishment figures who had so mismanaged the Great Revolt. Gamaliel II ended the division between his own house, that of Hillel, and that of Shammai. Much later Jewish tradition called him the first Nasi, prince or patriarch. The office began as an honorific for the head of the Central Rabbinical Academy, to distinguish him from those rabbis who led teaching circles. Gamaliel also chaired the reconstituted Sanhedrin, and quite possibly regulated the calendar. Gamaliel II was a difficult man to work with. He was briefly deposed for his bullying arrogance, and replaced by one Eleazar ben Azariah, but soon enough made his way back to the top again. There are two vexing difficulties with these stories of the earliest generations of rabbis. The first is that most of the tales are contained in documents composed many centuries after the events they purport to describe. We have no contemporary or even near contemporary evidence. What we have is only the material that much later editors chose to include for their own purposes. The second, and much more serious problem, is that the stories preserved in the voluminous rabbinic literature are all about rabbis. After Josephus signs off around the year 100, we are left only with the rabbinical books. That literature tells us precious little about Judean history and society in the imperial era. We only have a single work that addresses history. This is the Seder Olam Rabbah, the Great Order of the World, a rudimentary and thoroughly unreliable chronology, from Adam to the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Christian literature of the period is thick with description of the Roman environment in which it was written. The rabbinic books barely acknowledge the existence of Gentiles, let alone a mighty Gentile empire. The books portray Ben Zakkai and his successors and students as the saviours of the Jewish people and the Jewish religion. They were the intellectual heroes who preserved ancient traditions. They rescued a devastated people from their sorrow at the destruction of their capital and their temple. All this must be exaggerated. The emerging scholarly consensus is that in the 2 or even 3 centuries after the Great Revolt, most Jews had never even heard of the rabbis, let alone met one. The 40 or so Roman synagogues we have dug up never mention them. Every so often we do find the word rabbi used in one of the thousands of Jewish funerary inscriptions we have unearthed, or the odd Egyptian papyrus. But is this rabbi used in the conventional sense of teacher, or in the novel sense that the Mishnah uses? It is also difficult to believe that the priestly families and the Levites and the Sadducees simply relinquished their power and privileges to a bunch of parvenus. Even if the few historical nuggets in the rich rabbinical literature, the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Talmudim are reliable, they only illuminate the histories of a very, very small group of intellectuals. The greater course of Jewish society in the Middle Roman Empire is, so far, hidden from us. The Great Revolt saw the end of a Judean literary heritage of over 300 years that had flourished since Hellenistic times, and the writing of the Book of Daniel. The grand apocalyptic tradition of the Second Temple period sputtered out with the Jewish apocalypse of Ezra, not to be confused with the Greek book of the same name. Recall that Ezra was one of the Judean leaders who oversaw the return to Judea after the Babylonian captivity. In the Ethiopian tradition, the book is called Ezra Setuel, or Setuel, I really don't know how to pronounce it. In other Christian traditions, the Apocalypse of Ezra is incorporated into another book known by various names: Second Esdras, Third Esdras, or Fourth Esdras. You can hear all about that confusion in episode 2.3, Leaving Babylon Part 1, the Ezra Muddle. The book describes 7 visions given to Ezra by the angel Uriel. Each vision begins with a prayer by Ezra, in which he asks questions about God, Israel, and history. Next, Ezra and Uriel engage in dialogue. Each vision concludes with the angel's discourse about the end of times, and a description of the signs of its coming. Ezra stands with Revelation as the only apocalypse written after the fall of the temple. The Jewish apocalypse of Ezra is a final and rather sad defence of the apocalyptic worldview. This held that the imperial power oppressing the Judeans would soon be destroyed by heavenly forces. Who could believe that now? The temple was in ruins, and the angelic army missing in action. The apocalypse sank without trace in the Jewish tradition, but survived in Christianity as a metaphor of Christ's return. We also see the last of the Testaments, those of Moses and Abraham. Each is a farewell speech given by its dying hero. The author laments his sins and commends his virtues. He exhorts his hearers to avoid the former and emulate the latter. He provides practical lessons and concludes with a few predictions. In the Testament of Moses, the great leader passes secrets to his chosen successor, Joshua. Phrased as prophecies, Moses condemns the Maccabeans, lashes out at Herod the Great, and whacks the temple establishment. It could have been written by any one of the many groups who opposed the establishment: Essenes, Pharisees, or even the Zealots. The Testament of Abraham appears in the canon of the Ethiopian Jews. The angel Michael appears to Abraham before his death. Abraham refuses to leave this world without an angelic celestial tour. That tour granted, Abraham demands that the sinners he sees be punished. Then follows a lot of argy-bargy between the merciful, wise God and the quarrelsome, blockhead Abraham, who perversely refuses to die. At the end of his tether, God eventually pulls rank and sends Abraham to heaven. The Testament of Abraham was hugely popular in Christendom through the medieval period, although there is nothing Christian about it. For that matter, the book is barely Jewish. God appears as a hippie love child, bringing charity and hospitality and common sense morality. It depicts Judaism as a religion of commonplace ethical values, but still insists on the strictness of God's judgment and on his compassion. Just two other books comprise the final hurrah of the old Judaism, before the rabbinic movement overwhelmed all. These are two attributed to Baruch, scribe to the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived to see the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. In 4 Baruch, Jeremiah and Baruch bury all the sacred treasures of the temple in a secret place. The book assures us that one day the temple will be rebuilt and its riches restored. The other book, 2nd Baruch, implicitly supports the emerging rabbinic movement. Forget the temple, it says. We don't need it. We have the law, and that is who we are. Quote, 2nd Baruch 84:2. Remember that formerly Moses said, "If you transgress the law, you shall be dispersed." And now Moses used to tell you before they befell you, and lo, they have befallen you. I also say to you, after you have suffered, that if you obey those things which have been said to you, you will receive from the Mighty One whatever has been laid up and reserved for you. And remember you the law and Zion, and the Holy Land and your brethren, and the covenant of your fathers, and forget not the festivals and the Sabbaths. End quote. All these books were either passively left to disappear or actively suppressed. Some were preserved by Christians, and then only by accident, and often in obscure monasteries on the borderlands of Christendom and in Ethiopia. For more on that story, rewind to my episode 2.8, Lost Books of the New Testaments. The rabbis insisted that their oral tradition of the law trumped all. By so doing, they could disappear the vast literature produced after the Tanakh. The Old Testament was closed. Just as the apocalypses and testaments faded away, a new form of mystic literature appeared. This was inspired by the first chapter of Ezekiel, that used fantastical imagery to describe meeting the Godhead. We call it today Merkavah, or chariot mysticism. The first chapter of Ezekiel says nothing of a chariot, but the mystics decided that Ezekiel was indeed describing a chariot led by 4 beings. The aim of the students of the chariot mysticism was to follow Ezekiel in ascent, to explore the heavens and beyond the face of God. The chariot mystics in turn inspired another mystical literature, the Hakelot stories. Hope that's how you pronounce it. Hakelot means palaces or chambers. These stories describe ascents to heaven through a series of palaces. It's all rather like Dante's Divine Comedy. Neither the chariot nor the palace literature had anything to say about a Messiah, or the end of days, and the world to come, or a resurrection of the dead, or the restoration of Israel. They were all about humans gaining greater knowledge of the Godhead by approaching his very throne. In one way, they were the opposite of the apocalypses, which presented God descending to earth. In the next episode, I explore how Christians reacted to the Great Revolt. Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.